Arkham Audio presents Arkham Investigator Jenny Barnes, narrated by Nicole Patrice Fiscus. All copyrights belong to Fantasy Flight Games. If you enjoy this production, you can find this story and many more in the Investigators of Arkham hardcover book. Jenny Barnes, the Dilettante. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it, that this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the centuried grave. Even had its outlines been unfamiliar, we would have desired it, but as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. H.P. Lovecraft, The Hound. I held my breath when I walked in the room, expecting the worst. Things broken and overturned, blood on the walls. I was surprised to find it almost orderly, with only trace signs that items had been tampered with. The bed was made, but looked like it had been pawed over as someone searched for things hidden under it. Clothes in the drawers had been shifted, but not thrown about. It evoked the kind of eeriness that itches at your mind, like the temperature in the room when it is just below comfortable, or a note in a song that sends shivers down your back. I found them in the desk drawer. A pen had been left uncapped, something Izzy would never do, even at her most disorganized. My letters. I had been writing her for years, but these three were on the top. A chill seized me when I touched them, as I knew which ones they were. Dearest Izzy, greetings from the sticks. You would not believe where I am, darling. I am sorry it has been so long since I last wrote. I imagine this post will also take a dreadfully long time to get to you, but please know I have been thinking of you. You know I am not the short-tempered sort, but this journey has certainly whittled me down to sharper edges. When last I wrote you, I was about to head to a fete on the Dynamic at the port of Palermo. A bit rustic, certainly. You will remember how scandalized everyone was back home that I chose to visit Sicily and not Venice. And while I imagine it would have been a bit small for your taste, it was such a charming craft, all strung with lights. It glowed like an ember in the darkness. Wine flowed, and everyone was so gleeful. It was easy to get caught up in the excitement and the bounty of the evening. While there, I could not help but notice an older man whose excitement that evening seemed rather strained, as though, on a table set with blazing candles, one taper were guttering in its wax and struggling to remain lit. I thought myself brave to engage this curious creature in conversation, and lo and behold, the man was Professor Lucius Angstrom, a scholar and anthropologist of some note. It seemed he had little taste for parties, but he sought funding for a potential archaeological dig at a promising site at the Susa Valley near Turin, and had gone to a wealthy relation to seek it. The poor man hardly knew what he was in for. He had boarded the Dynamic at Marseille, thinking himself a guest for merely a single party. I dare say the man had nearly been shanghaied, finding himself not in the north of Italy, but in the far south instead. Pardon me for seeming as though I am mocking the poor fellow. His situation was rather humorous, but the pained look on his face and the nature of our shared interest in the anthropological moved me to inquire further about the dig site in question. His face bloomed with life, and I dare say he was nearly a different man. He went on and on about the curiousness of the location, how rich merely a single survey had been. That such a great find existed in a place so well trafficked was a wonder, he said, and he felt a dire need to act quickly, lest someone else take credit for the find. I inquired briefly why indeed this was the case, and at this his fires seemed to dim again. He mentioned, in a low and stuttering way, as a child might if caught in a lie, that although there were multiple cathedrals and abbeys in the area, there seemed to be a local superstition surrounding that particular site. It was viewed as a place both curious and potentially dangerous. But again, the flush returned to his cheeks, and he dismissed the notion as modern Christian thought seeking to paint all pagan activities with a brush of evil. Such superstitious claims were wholly unsubstantiated, he said. I will admit here that I did not guard my enthusiasm or my tolerance for alcohol as well as ordinarily I might have. The servers were like lithe ghosts, and I let myself fall fully into the fascinating dreams of a truly vast, undiscovered dig. Visions of wondrous items danced across my mind, and as the darkness of late night threatened to snuff out the lights of the ship and send everyone stumbling home, I promised the good professor that the dig would indeed happen, and I should be quite happy to fund it. Thus, you may have already received confused letters from our cousins Angelique and Jean-Paul, curious as to why I have not joined them in Paris yet. Blame good wine and an overabundance of ambition on my part. The worst of it was this. I demanded to be a part of the dig as well, and Engström was only too delighted to comply. I wish I could wholly blame the wine, but I think you know me far too well for that. So it was that upon the following morning I found myself meeting with the good professor at what seemed to me an intolerably early hour, speedily scratching out a check for expenses, and facing the cumbersome situation of having to put together some kind of baggage appropriate for an expedition of this nature. The professor was aghast at my insistence on bringing along my typewriter, but after I made it abundantly clear that either it went with me to the dig or there would be no dig at all, he wisely relented. While I set in order the remainder of my affairs, the good professor set forth immediately to Turin to go about meeting with his students and preparing the dig. I followed thereafter in what can only be described as a comedy of errors. It was a wonder I did eventually make my way to the Susa Valley. Such beauty! It is difficult to describe this place to you, Izzy. It seems as though it is both in the middle of everything and on the edge of the world. There are deep valleys and scrubby trees, wide pastures, and the towering white-capped spires of the Alps in the distance. I was so enamored of the wild and winding beauty of the place that I hardly minded how bumpy the ride was along the road. A road so ancient, it dates back to Roman days. It is so silly how we once thought our own house so old, and yet just today I rode along a path placed by hands thousands of years dead. The night seems to weigh so heavily here. It reminds me of the darkness around that boat in Palermo, but without the blaze of lights to stave off the gloom. The farmer who met me at the station was kind enough to drop me at the only local inn, a rustic little place called L'Ultima Lanterna, and I gratefully arranged myself a room for the night. I had just finished a delicious agnolotti when I asked the proprietor if he had any contact with a dig in the area, and if I might contact Professor Engström to let him know I had arrived. Izzy, you would have been shocked to see the change in the man's demeanor. I knew I did not have the best command of the dialect, but knowing both French and Italian, I had thought I could puzzle it out. I imagined I had offended him somehow. I opened my mouth to apologize, but he told me brusquely that it was a shame. So refined a lady would be in the company of such, I think he called them scoundrels or pirates. Nevertheless, he said he would send one of his workers to the dig in the morning to let them know I had arrived. I thanked him for his kindness, but he put up a hand to stop me and said in broken English, "That place is bad, bad place, maledetto. I leave alone. Others, maybe not." I tried to thank him, but he moved away and refused to speak to me again for the rest of the night. I thought I saw others around me look suspicious and move away, but I was tired, so I might remember it improperly. At any rate, What can one say about rustic superstition? It is charming when it is about things like putting out saucers of milk for the fairies, but watch out when a calf is born deformed or an ew's milk turns sour, and it seems everything might be an ill omen. I had to remind myself that overabundance of wine or not, I did choose to come out here, and I better well make the best of it. That said, my dear sister, I will end things here. The light of this lantern is getting low, and the professor is supposed to meet me sometime tomorrow, I would imagine. I shall send you a letter from the dig site and let you know what wonders we have found. Now I go to dream of that, and put the silly worries of ill omens and superstitions far behind me. Much love to you. Warmest regards, Jenny. I did not know how to read signs like that then. It was the first time, and the way I had been raised had put me in the permanent state of mind that I knew better. Knew better than to let someone tell me I should not go somewhere or that something did not bode well. I was certain the things that happened on the way there were mere inconveniences that made for a good letter, not any kind of warning. I simply would not have listened to the signs and warnings. Not back then. I wonder if they were laid out not to dissuade me from that path, but to warn me against future ones. My mind is now one that thinks about things like that, but back then it would have been as impossible as breathing underwater. I picked up the next letter. Things were not that bad. Yet. Dearest Izzy, things have been busy. The dig site is a rough place to live, but I am getting used to it. I will admit, I wish I had not come here, if only because early on I felt myself almost more an obstacle than an aid to the situation. When I met with Professor Engstrom at the inn, he assured me things were going well, and I had the expectation of arriving at a well-organized camp. Then, when we finally came to our destination, I found things in a state of half disarray, with boxes of tools only partly unpacked, research tents half set up, and the workers' rest area hardly more than a threadbare bit of tarp. My shock was apparent, and the professor was quick to explain that the disarray was due to the fact that it seemed every single patch of land had yielded some valuable find, shards of pottery, figurines, heads of weapons, and thus, every time they dug into the ground and attempted to make camp, some discovery had forced them to move things again. As the professor spoke, I confess I felt a slight stirring of unease. I remember being so charmed by how taken he was with the thrill of discovery back on the good ship Dynamic, how much it lit his face with delight. Now it seemed that light was something out of control, a bonfire that could consume him. I said that it was all well and good to take valuables out of the ground, but it made no sense if they were then put where the elements would destroy them. That seemed to snap him out of his reverie, and he sheepishly conceded my point. I asked if he had anyone on his staff who had more experience dealing with the outdoors, who perhaps had been a veteran of the Great War and knew how to make camp properly. To my great relief, the driver, a student of his named Peter Van Ryn, replied that he did, and Engstrom gave him the responsibility of being camp overseer. Thankfully, the man proved capable, and within short order, proper tents were erected for the staff and workers. Since then, things have been a whirlwind of activity, and although occasionally I have been enlisted to help clean off this or that item, it unfortunately seems that most of the time my best use is to stay well out of the way. The dig site expands at what seems a constant rate. Although the local villagers still want nothing to do with us, Professor Engstrom has been able to recruit plenty of hardy workers from Turin, especially ones who disagree with the fascists and have been forced out of work. Sadly, this has put us more at odds with the locals, who have begun to refuse to sell enough goods to keep the camp running smoothly. Although both the professor and Mr. Van Ryn objected to my suggestion that I be allowed to go hunting to supplement our food supplies, after I returned from an outing with 3 brace of ducks, the pair swiftly became enthusiastic about my success. In my spare time, I have hiked the wild valleys and visited multiple magnificent abbeys and cathedrals in the region. After I asked a monk at one of them about the area where the dig is, he crossed himself and began uttering a prayer of protection and would not speak to me further. Such it is with anyone local. It has become such a source of frustration for me that once, I am ashamed to admit, I sought out a local scholar with an affinity for drink and plied him with some local wines until he gave me some sparse bits of lore about the area. I had learned from Professor Engstrom that ancient Roman records mentioned a group of barbarians who lived there. They had battled tooth and nail to prevent an invasion of their territory and were said to have fought to the last. The local added his own bit of legend to the story. Those members of the tribe who were not killed in battle built a massive ceremonial pyre, and they leapt onto it together, rather than be taken as Roman slaves. Rather ghastly, and in keeping with the kind of grim poetry that legends of that time have, but what the local added was that every time anyone had attempted to settle there, something had gone wrong. Murders, disappearances, and the like. When I pointed out that these were as likely to have occurred anywhere else in the valley, the man simply snorted, said something rude in the local dialect, and refused to speak to me further. There have been darker moments at the camp as well, and I dare say that individually these events would seem like silly pranks, but together they fill me with the greatest feeling of unease. Strange things like objects going missing or broken tools. One morning we all awoke to find the area had been trampled all around by something with hooves, although no shepherds here keep goats or would drive them near our camp if they did. No one had heard nor seen anything during the night. Once, after I had shot a wild boar and we had our cook field dress it, we had buried the offal in a sack. The following morning we found the blood-stained sack next to a fire in which the guts had apparently been burned. The residue was as fresh as if the offal had been set aflame an hour previous. Again, no one had seen anything. No one has been hurt, and nothing valuable has been stolen, but these events have been taking their toll on the workers. Some have left and doubtlessly talked to the locals, who are even more wary of us than before. Workers who have stayed have done so either from need or because the professor has invested in so many casks of the strong local liquor called grappa, a crude way to raise morale. There is a bright side, however. For all the pallor of this place and the low level of dread, Professor Engstrom has been working at a near frenzy, and under Mr. Van Ryn's careful supervision, the team has been uncovering an incredible number of artifacts, piled in layer after layer. The other day, we came upon a rather remarkable discovery not far from the center of camp. A barrel, dug into the earth and propped with massive stones. Mr. Van Ryn said the stones were likely chiseled out of a far-off hill and dragged for miles before they were fitted into place. Imagine that! The professor was gleeful at the find, saying it was very likely the burial place of a high-ranking member of their society. It was half collapsed, and so eager was he to explore the inside that he set every member of the team to digging out the entrance. This is the strangest thing, but once the entryway was halfway cleared, I volunteered to go inside myself and investigate. Mr. Van Ryn protested, saying it was unsafe, but I was smaller than anyone else and could easily fit, and the professor consented. While the other members of the team worked on clearing out the entrance further, I went in with a lantern to examine the interior. It was extraordinary. Awfully musty and dirty, to be sure. I wrapped a spare shirt around my face and hair, and still it was hardly enough. But it was truly remarkable to be the first one in such a place in countless years. I carefully made note of various semi-intact vases and bits of pottery, but then noticed suddenly there was a looming statue in a corner. I looked closer and saw with disquiet it was a man looking menacing and leering, with rough features, and further still, I noticed that not only was he naked, but someone had cheekily snapped his manhood right off. Oh, Izzy, I am a mature woman, but I admit something about that made me blush terribly and look away as though with shame. But when I did so, the light of my lantern caught a small glint of something lying on the dirt floor, and I leaned in for a closer look. I picked up the object and brushed it off, and found that it was the most interesting thing. A small medallion no taller than my pinky finger, probably of bronze and so unusually heavy. To be sure, I do not claim a full archaeologist's knowledge of such things, but it seems far more intricate than I would expect jewelry to be from such folk. On its face is a man, crafted with such familiarity I could swear I have seen him in the village nearby, and on the reverse some kind of spiral pattern. All but the edges are covered with a fine verdigris. It captured my attention so wholly I started with shock when the workers called out that they had cleared the entrance for others. Without quite knowing why, I simply pocketed the medallion and I continued in assisting with the dig. I know you will probably think less of me for this, but forgive me. I did not mention the medallion to either Professor Engstrom, who I doubt would even care, obsessed as he is with what is yet to be found, or Mr. Van Ryn. I have already sent a letter to a talented jeweler I know in Marseille, with a sketch and a description of the medallion, and a request to make a copy. If he does a proper job, I have told myself I shall return the original and be content with the facsimile. Another night here draws to a close, and so does this letter. I hope it finds you well, dear Izzy. Think well of your foolish sister out here on her odd quest. Warm regards, Jenny. Last letter, dated 2 months later. The situation had gone downhill much faster than that, but it took time to even begin to put things into words. I had to type, because I remember every time I tried to write something by hand, the letters quivered. It was easy to tell myself I was just putting off writing until I found a new typewriter. I learned more quickly than anything how easy it was to lie to myself, and how much I hated it. Isabel, I am so sorry it has taken me so long to write. I know you have probably heard from Jean-Paul and Angelique that I am in Marseille, but doubtless they are surprised and offended that I have leased my own apartment rather than stay with them. They are very polite, but I do not think I can make them understand. I do not even know how much I can tell you or understand myself. The dig is gone, and Professor Engstrom is dead, and I barely escaped with my own life. That is the short version of it, but in the long one there is so much I can hardly describe it. I have written this letter over and over in my head since the night it happened. This is the 7th time I have tried to type out the first page, and I do not know if I can even finish this one, but I shall try, Izzy, for your sake and mine. I hope my last letters got to you all right. If they did, you will remember I mentioned the growing agitation of the professor, the wariness of the locals, and the strange things that had been occurring. It was a combination that was not stable. Finally, things came to a head in the worst of ways. While I had been doing my best to supply the camp with what food I could hunt, the workers had been growing increasingly upset with the reluctance of the locals to sell to us. The locals had heard of the strange occurrences at the dig site and took them as evidence that the place was cursed, while the workers blamed the locals for the incidents. That night, a group of workers stole the truck from Mr. Van Ryn, broke into the stocks of the local inn, and made off with some of its goods. When they returned, Van Ryn was furious and fired them on the spot, but they were too drunk and numerous to force out of the camp, and we resolved to leave the matter until morning, when we planned to pay the owners of the inn for the damages. We never had the chance to apologize. Some locals had seen the crime and recognized the truck, and their resentment ripened into rage. They organized an angry mob and set upon us in the night, determined to drive us out. I woke to yelling and ran outside to see them tearing down tents, shattering our artifacts and breaking our digging tools. Some carried torches, others lanterns, but all I saw in the darkness of that fateful night seemed to me like the shrieking faces of demons. Suddenly there was a shot, the chilling report of a pistol, and one of them fell, in his death just an angry but innocent man. Eyes turned to the source, Professor Engstrom wielding a pistol and holding a torch. "Back!" he screamed. "These treasures will never be for you!" And he hurled the torch into the center of the excavation pit where moments ago workers had been celebrating and into which a keg of grappa had been moved. The fire that leapt into the air seemed to snarl like a living thing, and all hell broke loose. The professor continued to shoot, and men fell. Workers and locals attacked each other in a frenzy, and I stood transfixed at the sight until Mr. Van Ryn roughly grabbed my arm, startling me out of my reverie, and yelled that we had to go. In a daze, I grabbed only what I could carry, including the strange medallion which I had taken to wearing around my neck, and joined him and the few students Engstrom had brought with him. We piled onto the old truck and tore away into the night. The last I saw of Engstrom was a vision of him in the night, laughing and throwing himself onto the pyre that the excavation pit had become. We made our way back to Turin with little more than the clothes on our backs and whatever scant objects we were able to save from the dig. Mr. Van Ryn brought me along to testify before the authorities, and I knew it was only my status as a citizen of wealth that kept all of us from jail. We were told in no uncertain terms that the authorities did not want to hear any more of the situation, that lives had already been lost and the camp had been burned to the ground, and the place in question would be declared a restricted area by the government. Some items from the dig were confiscated, but to my great relief, within 2 days we were all cleared to go, with the strong advisement that we should leave Italy in a hurry. We counted ourselves lucky and did so. I bid an exhausted farewell to Van Ryn when we were safely across the border, via boat to Marseille, as none of us wanted to go anywhere near the Susa Valley again. And though he made some overtures to stay in touch, I found myself too traumatized to want anything more to do with him, even if he doubtlessly was as shaken by the experience as I. I have spent the time since in this apartment, pacing and trying to make sense of it all. One of my few visits out has been to the jeweler I mentioned in the previous letter. His work of the replica medallion was exquisite, and I have had him send it along to you. Somehow, holding on to the original makes me feel a connection with the one I know is headed to your hands, and it gives me a sense of peace. I cannot really explain it, but I find myself in that position rather a lot lately. Forgive me if I do not return home right away. I am grateful to be alive, and while part of me would like nothing more than to run out, bury myself in beautiful and expensive things, and eat and drink to gladly celebrate that fact, I cannot stop thinking about what I have been through. I have seen quiet folk become monsters, and felt dread and terror so deeply I sensed my heart was ready to escape my body. It is not easy to evade those kinds of feelings or to forget them any more than it is for those who have seen the horror of war to put their nightmares outside of their minds for good. I have to find a meaning in what I have been through. In the meantime, think of me, and I hope that medallion finds you well and safe. I love you, sister. Yours, Jenny. The final passage and the paragraph just before it, the one about the medallion, were underlined as if by a hand tightening on the pen. Someone had been reading my letters to Izzy, but why? What importance did these marks hold? Why had her room been ransacked? And where was Izzy now? I wish I had written more about the medallion, had left myself more clues. I remember too much about the tragedy of how the dig ended, and not that much else. I have learned a great many things since that night, however, and the first of those is that I am no good at giving up.